Play this piano, and I might marry you," Victoria Caldwell said loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear, her champagne glass catching the golden light of the crystal chandeliers above, and the laughter that followed rolled across the room like a practiced echo in a place where people were used to laughing at the right moments, even when they weren't sure why. The charity gala at the Whitmore Foundation Hall had already drawn in the city's most powerful names, CEOs in tailored tuxedos, socialites wrapped in silk, venture capitalists trading whispers worth millions, and right at the edge of the marble floor, moving quietly between reflections of polished shoes and shimmering gowns, Nathaniel Brooks pushed a janitor's cart with slow, deliberate steps, his navy uniform pressed but simple, his badge slightly worn, his presence nearly invisible to everyone except the woman who had just turned him into the evening's entertainment. Victoria leaned against the glossy black Steinway. Placed at the center of the ballroom, the piano meant for the scheduled performance later that night, her blonde hair catching the chandelier light as she gestured toward Nathaniel again, smiling like she was offering him a favor rather than a challenge. "Come on, don't be shy. Everyone deserves a chance to impress me," she added, her voice playful but edged with something colder, and a few guests lifted their phones, sensing the kind of moment that could circulate through social media before the night even ended. Nathaniel didn't look up right away. He continued wiping a faint smudge near the edge of the marble floor, his movements calm, almost measured, as if the laughter around him belonged to another room entirely, and the silence in his expression only seemed to encourage Victoria further. "What's the matter?" she said, tilting her head. "Never touched a piano before." A man beside her chuckled. Another guest whispered something about "this should be good," and the hum of conversation shifted into anticipation. Nathaniel finally paused, straightened slowly, and looked toward the piano, his gaze steady, unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't ask for attention but somehow drew it anyway. Across the room, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit lowered his glass slightly, watching more closely now, while a young event coordinator near the entrance hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or simply let the moment unfold. Victoria tapped the piano lid lightly with her fingernail, the sound sharp and delicate. "Just play something," she said, smiling again. "If it's good, I might actually be impressed." And another ripple of laughter followed, softer this time, as if even the room sensed something shifting. Nathaniel placed the cloth he had been holding onto the cart, his movements unhurried, his shoulders relaxed, and for a moment, the only sound in the ballroom was the distant clink of glass against glass. He stepped forward, one quiet step at a time, the polished marble reflecting his silhouette beneath the chandelier glow, and the guests who had been chatting moments earlier began turning their heads, curiosity replacing amusement. Victoria crossed her arms, still smiling, confident, certain she controlled the room, certain she controlled the moment. But as Nathaniel moved closer to the piano, the laughter faded entirely, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, as if the entire ballroom had leaned forward at once, waiting for a janitor to prove he belonged nowhere near the instrument he was about to touch. The wheels of Nathaniel Brooks's cart stopped just short of the piano bench, and for a moment, he simply stood there, the light from the chandelier settling across his shoulders while the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, and Victoria Caldwell tilted her head slightly, as if she was studying an unexpected detail in a painting she did not quite understand, her smile still in place, but no longer effortless, while a few guests shifted their weight on polished leather shoes, and the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence that had replaced laughter. Nathaniel reached forward and gently pulled the piano bench back by a few inches, the soft scrape across the marble floor sounding louder than it should have in a room this large, and someone near the back cleared their throat before quickly falling quiet again, while the older gentleman in the charcoal suit leaned forward slightly, his brows narrowing as if something about the way Nathaniel moved felt familiar. Victoria took a slow sip of champagne, her posture still relaxed, but her eyes did not leave him now, and the phones that had been raised earlier remained steady, their tiny screens glowing like scattered stars across the dimmed ballroom. Nathaniel rested his hand lightly on the edge of the piano, not pressing any keys yet, simply feeling the surface beneath his fingertips as if reacquainting himself with something he had known long before this room, long before the laughter, long before the polished marble floors and million-dollar conversations, and his expression remained calm, almost distant, as though he had stepped into a memory no one else could see. Across the room, the event coordinator lowered her clipboard slowly, and two venture capitalists who had been whispering moments earlier stopped mid-conversation, their attention now pulled toward the quiet figure seated in front of the Steinway. Victoria gave a soft laugh, lighter this time, almost uncertain. "Well, go ahead," she said, her voice no longer cutting through the room but settling into it. And Nathaniel adjusted the bench slightly, positioning himself with measured precision, his posture straight, his shoulders relaxed. Movements that did not belong to someone improvising under pressure, but to someone who understood exactly where he was and exactly what he was about to do. The older gentleman shifted again, recognition flickering behind his eyes, while a young woman near the stage whispered to her companion that something felt different, though she could not explain why. And Nathaniel finally lifted his hands above the keys, pausing just before touching them, allowing the silence to stretch just a second longer, long enough for the entire ballroom to lean into the moment without realizing it, long enough for Victoria Caldwell to lower her glass halfway, her confidence no longer as certain as it had been minutes earlier. And in that stillness, before a single note was played, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. No longer waiting for a joke, no longer expecting a performance meant for amusement, but sensing something quieter, something heavier, as Nathaniel Brooks lowered his fingers toward the keys with the calm certainty of someone who had never needed permission to belong. The first note landed softly, almost fragile, and yet it traveled across the ballroom like a ripple across still water, and Nathaniel Brooks did not rush the moment. He allowed the sound to breathe, his fingers moving with deliberate patience, each key pressed with quiet certainty, and the room that had once leaned forward in amusement now leaned forward in silence, because what they heard was not hesitation, not experimentation, but control. The second phrase followed, deeper, more confident, and the melody unfolded with a clarity that did not belong to coincidence, while the crystal glasses on nearby tables seemed to vibrate faintly with the resonance, and Victoria Caldwell's smile faded completely, her posture straightening without her realizing it, her eyes fixed on Nathaniel's hands as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed only moments earlier. A guest near the back lowered his phone slowly, no longer filming for humor, but recording something he did not want to miss. And the older gentleman in the charcoal suit leaned even closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition, while two women standing near the entrance exchanged glances, their whispers replaced by quiet attention. Nathaniel's fingers moved with increasing confidence, gliding across the keys with fluid precision, the melody building, rising, then softening again, as if the piano itself had been waiting for him, and the sound filled the ballroom in a way that felt both intimate and vast, reaching every corner without force, without strain. The event coordinator near the doorway placed her clipboard down on the table beside her, her eyes wide, and one of the venture capitalists who had been checking his watch minutes earlier now stood still, his hand frozen mid-gesture, while the air in the room felt charged with something unspoken. Victoria shifted her weight slightly, her champagne glass now lowered completely, her confidence replaced by a quiet uncertainty, and she glanced briefly at the guests around her, noticing that no one was laughing anymore. No one was whispering. Every face turned toward the man she had just mocked. Nathaniel's expression remained calm, focused, distant, as though the crowd had disappeared and only the piano remained. His posture steady, shoulders relaxed, movements practiced and precise, and the melody deepened again, revealing layers that carried emotion without exaggeration, confidence without display. Across the room, the older gentleman exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief, and murmured something under his breath, while a young man near the bar shook his head quietly, the realization spreading from person to person without a single word. Victoria Caldwell blinked once, then again, her gaze fixed, and for the first time that evening, she did not look like someone controlling the room. She looked like someone watching it slip away, because the janitor she had turned into a joke was no longer the center of amusement. He had become the center of gravity, and as Nathaniel Brooks continued to play, the silence in the ballroom grew deeper, heavier, as if the entire room had stepped into a moment none of them had expected and none of them would forget. The melody expanded with quiet confidence, each note layered with intention, and Nathaniel Brooks did not look up once, his attention anchored to the keys as if the world beyond them no longer existed. While the sound shifted from gentle introduction into something more complex, more deliberate, and the guests who had once stood casually now held themselves still, their posture reflecting the weight of the moment unfolding before them. The older gentleman in the charcoal suit slowly set his glass down on a nearby table, his eyes narrowing as recognition sharpened, and he leaned toward the woman beside him, whispering something that caused her expression to change from curiosity to surprise, her gaze immediately returning to Nathaniel's hands moving across the piano. Victoria Caldwell remained near the instrument, her earlier confidence replaced by stillness, her fingers lightly gripping the stem of her champagne glass, and she watched as Nathaniel transitioned into a passage that flowed with effortless precision, the melody rising, then falling, like a conversation carried without words. The sound filled the high ceiling of the ballroom, brushing against crystal chandeliers and polished marble, and a guest near the entrance quietly stepped closer, drawn by something that felt less like a performance and more like a revelation. The event coordinator exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously, while two executives who had been discussing market trends earlier now stood side by side, their conversation forgotten, and the glow from their phones dimmed as some lowered them. Realizing this moment deserved attention beyond a screen, Nathaniel's expression remained calm, his movements controlled, his fingers gliding from one passage to another with quiet authority, and the melody deepened again, carrying emotion that felt both restrained and powerful, as though each note told a story the room was only beginning to understand. The older gentleman straightened slightly, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the woman beside him, and she nodded slowly, her eyes widening, while another guest overheard and turned, curiosity spreading like a silent wave. Victoria shifted her stance again, her shoulders no longer relaxed, and she glanced briefly around the ballroom, noticing that every eye remained fixed on Nathaniel, the laughter from earlier now replaced by respect that formed without announcement. The music grew more intricate, weaving between light and shadow, and the silence in the room became deeper, heavier, as though the air itself had slowed to listen. A young man near the bar shook his head quietly, his disbelief evident, while the event coordinator pressed her hands together lightly, drawn into the moment. Nathaniel did not acknowledge the crowd. He continued playing with measured confidence, his posture steady, his presence grounded, and as the melody reached a gentle pause before rising again, the older gentleman finally murmured clearly enough for those nearest to hear, his voice filled with recognition, and the guests closest to him leaned in, the realization beginning to form. While Victoria Caldwell stood motionless beside the piano, her expression shifting once more, because the janitor she had challenged was no longer just surprising the room, he was changing it. The melody softened for a moment, then shifted into a passage so delicate that the room seemed to lean even closer, and Nathaniel Brooks played with a quiet confidence that no longer felt surprising but undeniable, his fingers moving with the ease of someone returning to a language he had spoken his entire life. And the older gentleman in the charcoal suit finally straightened fully, his expression firm with recognition, as he whispered more clearly this time, "That phrasing, that is not just training." And the woman beside him looked back toward Nathaniel with widened eyes, her posture changing as realization began to settle. Across the ballroom, the event coordinator slowly stepped forward, drawn closer without thinking, while two guests near the bar exchanged a glance that carried the same unspoken question, and the air felt heavier, charged with curiosity that no one wanted to interrupt. Victoria Caldwell remained motionless, her champagne glass now resting untouched in her hand, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel's hands as the melody grew richer, deeper, the notes unfolding like a story told with restraint, and her earlier smile had disappeared completely, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. Nathaniel transitioned seamlessly into a new passage, his shoulders relaxed, his posture steady, and the sound filled the ballroom in a way that felt effortless, as though the piano had been waiting for him. And a guest near the entrance lowered his phone entirely. No longer interested in capturing the moment, but simply experiencing it. The older gentleman leaned toward the group nearest him, his voice low but steady, and the words traveled quietly from one person to another, the ripple of recognition spreading without noise, and a young man near the bar murmured softly, as if confirming what he had just heard. Victoria blinked once, then again, her confidence shifting further, and she glanced briefly at the faces around her, noticing that their attention was no longer on her, no longer on the challenge she had issued, but entirely on Nathaniel Brooks. The melody rose gently, then resolved into a phrase that carried both elegance and precision, and the silence that followed lasted only a fraction of a second before Nathaniel continued, his hands moving with the calm assurance of mastery. The older gentleman nodded slowly, his expression now certain, and he spoke again, clearer this time, enough for those nearest to hear, and the woman beside him inhaled softly, her eyes widening as she repeated the name under her breath. Across the room, the event coordinator turned toward them, catching the whisper, and the realization spread quietly, guest by guest, like a soft current moving through the crowd. Victoria Caldwell shifted her stance once more, her posture no longer confident but attentive, and for the first time that evening, she looked not at Nathaniel's uniform, but at his hands, his presence, the quiet authority that had taken hold of the entire ballroom. Nathaniel continued playing, unaware or unconcerned with the recognition forming around him, his expression calm, his focus steady, and as the melody deepened again, the room understood that this was no longer a surprise performance. It was something far more significant, and the janitor who had been challenged minutes earlier was now becoming someone the entire ballroom was beginning to recognize. The melody transitioned again, smoother now, more confident, and Nathaniel Brooks leaned slightly forward as his fingers moved across the keys with a fluid precision that felt both effortless and deliberate, and the ballroom remained still, every guest anchored to the sound that filled the air like a quiet current, while the older gentleman in the charcoal suit finally spoke clearly enough for the small circle around him to hear. "That is Nathaniel Brooks," and the woman beside him inhaled sharply, her eyes widening as she repeated the name under her breath, the recognition spreading quickly but quietly among the nearest guests. A young executive standing nearby turned his head toward them, confusion flickering across his face before understanding settled in, and he glanced back toward the piano with renewed attention, while the event coordinator stepped closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to realization. Victoria Caldwell remained motionless beside the piano, her earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet uncertainty, and she glanced toward the small group where the whisper had begun, her brows narrowing slightly as she caught fragments of the name, though she did not fully understand yet. Nathaniel continued playing, unaware or unconcerned with the growing recognition, his posture steady, shoulders relaxed, the melody unfolding with graceful control, and the sound carried across the high ceiling, brushing the crystal chandeliers and reflecting softly off the polished marble floor. The older gentleman nodded slowly, his certainty growing, and he added quietly, "Founder of Brooks Holdings." And the woman beside him pressed her hand lightly against her chest, her surprise visible, while another guest leaned in closer, the name passing from one person to another like a ripple across calm water. Victoria shifted her stance again, her champagne glass still untouched in her hand, and she glanced at the faces around her, noticing the subtle change in their expressions, the respect forming, the curiosity deepening, and she turned her attention back to Nathaniel, her gaze no longer dismissive but searching. The melody softened briefly before rising again, Nathaniel's fingers moving with quiet authority, and the event coordinator whispered to herself as recognition settled in, while a young man near the bar lowered his phone completely, understanding that the moment had become something far beyond entertainment. The older gentleman straightened fully now, his voice calm but certain, and he spoke the name again, this time clear enough for those nearby to hear, and the realization spread faster, guest by guest, the atmosphere shifting from curiosity to astonishment. Victoria Caldwell blinked slowly, her confidence continuing to fade as she noticed the change in the room, the laughter gone, the attention no longer hers, and she looked again at Nathaniel Brooks, not at his uniform, but at the calm precision in his movements, the quiet command in his presence. Nathaniel continued playing without interruption, the melody reaching a graceful peak before easing into another passage, and the room remained silent, the recognition now forming fully around him. As the janitor she had challenged moments earlier became someone the entire ballroom was beginning to understand, and the balance of the room shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, toward him. The melody reached a graceful crescendo, and Nathaniel Brooks allowed the final sequence to unfold with measured control, his fingers gliding across the keys with a quiet authority that left no doubt about the mastery behind every note. And the ballroom stood completely still, the silence between phrases becoming just as powerful as the music itself, while the recognition that had begun as whispers now settled into certainty. The older gentleman in the charcoal suit spoke again, this time without lowering his voice. "That is him, Nathaniel Brooks," and the words traveled farther than before, carried by the silence, and several guests turned immediately, their eyes widening as the name connected with memory, headlines, and reputation. A woman near the entrance whispered to her companion, and he nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the piano with a new level of respect, while the event coordinator placed her hand lightly against the table beside her, absorbing the moment as understanding spread across the room. Victoria Caldwell remained beside the piano, her champagne glass now lowered completely, her posture no longer relaxed but attentive, and she glanced around the ballroom, noticing the shift in expressions, the quiet astonishment forming, and she looked back at Nathaniel, her confidence replaced by uncertainty as she realized the room was no longer responding to her presence but to his. Nathaniel transitioned into the final passage, the melody softening, then rising once more, each note placed with deliberate precision, and the sound carried gently across the chandelier-lit ceiling, the last sequence unfolding like a calm conclusion to a story that had changed the entire room. The older gentleman nodded slowly, his voice calm but clear. He built Brooks Holdings from nothing, and a young executive nearby exhaled quietly, the recognition now complete, while another guest murmured that he had seen Nathaniel featured in a financial magazine only months earlier. Victoria blinked slowly, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel's hands, and for the first time that evening she appeared unsure of her footing, her earlier challenge now distant, overshadowed by the reality unfolding in front of her. Nathaniel allowed the final notes to settle, his fingers resting lightly above the keys before lifting slowly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, deeper, filled with understanding that had replaced amusement. He sat still for a moment, calm, composed, then gently closed the piano lid halfway, his movements unhurried, as though he had simply finished a quiet conversation rather than changed the entire atmosphere of the ballroom. The guests remained silent, the recognition complete, and Victoria Caldwell stood motionless beside him, her expression shifting once more as the balance of the evening moved fully away from her control. Because the janitor she had challenged had just revealed something far greater than talent, and the entire ballroom now understood that Nathaniel Brooks had never needed permission to belong. The silence lingered after the final note, not awkward but heavy with recognition, and Nathaniel Brooks slowly rose from the bench with the same calm composure he had shown when he first approached the piano, his movements unhurried, his expression steady, as though the transformation of the entire ballroom had been nothing more than a quiet pause in his evening. The older gentleman in the charcoal suit gave a small nod of respect, and several guests nearby followed, their posture shifting subtly, their earlier curiosity now replaced by admiration, while a young executive near the bar stepped forward slightly, his voice low but audible, repeating the name again, and this time it spread faster, carried from one guest to another until the whisper became a quiet understanding shared across the room. Victoria Caldwell remained beside the piano, her champagne glass now lowered completely at her side, and she watched as Nathaniel stepped back, the space between them suddenly feeling larger than before, her earlier confidence replaced by hesitation, as she glanced at the guests around her and noticed the way their attention had shifted fully toward him. Nathaniel reached for the cloth resting on the cart and folded it carefully, his movements calm, grounded, as though returning to the role he had quietly held before the moment unfolded. And the simplicity of the gesture only deepened the contrast between how he had been perceived and who he truly was. The event coordinator stepped forward slightly, her expression respectful, while two executives who had once stood near Victoria now positioned themselves subtly closer to Nathaniel, drawn by the quiet authority that seemed to follow him. The older gentleman cleared his throat softly and addressed Nathaniel directly, his voice measured. "Mr. Brooks, that was remarkable." And Nathaniel offered a small nod in acknowledgement, his expression unchanged, his calm presence filling the space without effort. Victoria blinked slowly, her gaze shifting between Nathaniel and the guests around her, realizing that the room she had controlled minutes earlier had moved beyond her reach, and she took a small step forward, her voice softer than before, uncertain, as she began to speak but paused, searching for words that no longer came easily. Nathaniel adjusted the cart slightly, his posture relaxed, and glanced briefly at the piano, then back toward the room, his expression thoughtful but composed. And the guests remained quiet, waiting, as though the evening itself had shifted direction. The event coordinator exchanged a glance with the older gentleman, and he nodded once more, the respect in his expression unmistakable, while the recognition of Nathaniel Brooks continued to settle across the ballroom. Victoria Caldwell stood still, her earlier challenge now distant, her confidence replaced by reflection, as the realization fully formed that the janitor she had mocked had not just surprised the room, he had redefined it, and Nathaniel Brooks, calm and composed, returned to his place beside the cart, the quiet center of gravity in a ballroom that had changed completely. Nathaniel Brooks rested his hand lightly on the handle of the cart, the quiet returning to the ballroom in a way that felt different now, heavier with understanding, and he glanced once more toward the piano before turning slightly as though ready to continue his work. But the older gentleman stepped forward again, his voice respectful. "Mr. Brooks, you changed the entire room." And Nathaniel paused, offering a calm nod, his expression steady, his presence grounded, while several guests nearby echoed the sentiment with quiet murmurs of appreciation. Victoria Caldwell stood just a few feet away, her earlier confidence replaced by reflection, and she took a slow step forward, her voice softer than before. "I did not realize," she began, then paused, searching for words that felt appropriate in a moment that had shifted beyond her expectations, and Nathaniel looked toward her, calm and composed, his expression neither proud nor dismissive, simply steady. She lowered her gaze briefly, then met his eyes again. "You surprised everyone," she said quietly, and Nathaniel allowed a faint, respectful nod, his voice measured as he finally spoke. "Sometimes people only see the uniform, not the person wearing it." And the words settled into the room with quiet weight, drawing the attention of every guest once more. Victoria absorbed the statement, her posture relaxing slightly, and she gave a small nod of acknowledgement, while the event coordinator nearby offered a subtle smile. The atmosphere now calm, reflective, and respectful. Nathaniel adjusted the cloth on the cart once more, his movements unhurried, and he turned slightly toward the edge of the ballroom, as though returning to the rhythm of the evening. But before he moved, he added one more sentence, his voice calm and even. "Talent does not need to announce itself, it only needs a moment." And the silence that followed carried the message across the entire room. The older gentleman smiled faintly, and several guests nodded in agreement, the respect in their expressions unmistakable, while Victoria Caldwell stood still, her earlier challenge now transformed into quiet admiration, and she offered a small, sincere nod in return. Nathaniel Brooks then guided the cart forward with slow, deliberate steps, the polished marble reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above, and the guests watched him move across the ballroom, their attention following him not out of curiosity but respect. The event coordinator returned to her position. The executives resumed their quiet conversations, but the tone of the evening had shifted, calmer, more thoughtful, as if the entire ballroom had learned something without being told. Victoria remained near the piano for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the keys that had just filled the room with unexpected brilliance. Then she turned slowly, her expression reflective, while Nathaniel Brooks continued toward the far end of the ballroom, calm, composed, and unchanged, leaving behind a room that now understood that dignity did not depend on appearance, and that quiet confidence could speak louder than any introduction.